Uh, so let me give you.
Namaste, Namaste, Samir. An honor to be on your podcast. I think we were looking forward to this for a very long time, but I'm glad we can finally sit down.
Yeah, namaste to you too. Thank you so much. Yeah, so we've been coordinating, and it's great to have you here. So, in the interest of everyone, just let me give people a little bit of an introduction about you. So, Rashmi Samant is an inspiring young leader who's made history as the first Bharatiya female president of the Oxford University Student Union. She's a very familiar face on national television debates, columnist for a variety of national dailies, and a passionate advocate for Hindu rights as well as marginalized indigenous communities. Rashmi has addressed the global Hindu representation in the British Parliament, and her debut book, Hindu in Oxford, became a bestseller, I believe, in minutes. So, and she's also authored a book on Ram Janmabhoomi. So, Rashmi, welcome to the podcast.
Thank
Nice to have you here.
you. Thank you. Thank you for this kind introduction.
Great. So, Rashmi, I would want to jump into the thing that kind of probably brought you into the public attention, right? So, your journey in Oxford was very fascinating. So, you went there from a relatively small town from Udupi to becoming the first Bharatiya woman to be elected as a president. Can you share a little bit of the background as to what motivated you to enter student politics in a foreign land, in a foreign university where you've gone? And I believe it was during the stressful COVID period as well. So can you get into a little bit of background as to what kind of propelled you?
Well, Samir, I think it's very, very interesting. Like you said, I come from a very small town, Udupi. And it's not like my parents are from here and I was raised in some big city. I was also raised here all my life. But I've always had sort of a flair for leadership since I was little. Uh, if there's a bully who's sort of trying to steal little kids tiffin, I'd be the one like sort of standing up for the rights of the child. So I was more of that leader of the poor and the downtrodden and the bullied, and so I was mostly that growing up. And I did these little roles, being class prefect, class leader, etc. So I had this whole history doing stuff like that. But of course, I mean, that doesn't mean that you go on and challenge the very position of president of the Oxford University Students Union. My entire journey to Oxford was also very unconventional. It wasn't those big
Mhm.
consultancies putting together my application kind of a process. I literally had nobody who knew how to get in or got in. It was just one of those, go to the website, Google, apply to Oxford. And I applied back in 2019, and at that point there weren't as many resources online as there is today,
Right.
podcasts and guides and whatnot. Limited resources. I just followed the instructions on the website, the sort of stuff that doesn't get anybody anywhere.
Hmm.
And it was literally a moonshot. But like they say about moonshot, you shoot for the moon, you miss, you land among the stars. It was one of those moments for me, and I'm very glad that I tried. And I think coming from a relatively smaller town gives you that reckless optimism, because if you want to make it out there, then you need to have it, and then it gives
Right.
you also the power to like withstand insults of people or judgment from people, because you have nothing to lose. You come from a small
Right.
town, you don't care what people talk about you. So I think it was like a bunch of combination of that, and then the unconventional journey to Oxford sort of happened. Once I was on campus, I was extremely happy because I'm anyway a product of the Macaulay's, education
Hmm.
system. Even if I pride myself as somebody who was born and raised in a temple town, eventually the education sort of catches up to your ideals, ideology, and outlook of the world. So I genuinely thought that University of Oxford was number one, and you've made it. In fact, very happy first couple of months. But I think, for someone who's known, who's got this rooting in history, passed on through generations, whose ancestors have seen that struggle, somewhere or the other, that fight, that recognition, that consciousness opens up. For me, initially it was all things bright and blue and rosy and gold. But then once I started really opening my eyes, looking around the campus, I started realizing that the campus was a cesspool of colonial remnants, still touted around like a trophy. And that was not it. It was just not statues of these big slave owners being put around, which there were plenty of, from Cecil Rhodes to Christopher Codrington, who've done unspeakable things to,
Right.
indigenous people across the world. But it was also the syllabus which was being taught, and it would say stuff like colonization was somehow a positive experience for indigenous people who are ancestors of yours and mine. But we know that it was the most horrible experience, that we were literally left with a begging bowl. It was exploitation on all fronts. But the sort of narrative which is pushed in those history books, the kind of funding which is still on to push that narrative, it doesn't just end with distortion of history, but it gets extended to this sort of global market forces, and economic sort of constraints which are then brought in as a result of this historical interpretation. It is somehow told that we are new to this sort of whole idea of civilization, so we still need to do jobs which are BPO type, wherein
Mm.
the bosses are still in the West and we
Right.
just sort of follow along because we are new to civilization. That's literally what they say,
Right.
that before the British came along about 300 years ago, that we were all living in the jungles, didn't know how to eat, speak, or clothe. So even today, we are just learning. That's how it's
Right.
put out. And as a result of that, we are still at the bottom of the economic pyramid, putting in the most amount of work, reaping the least amount of benefits. Just like how, we work for consultancies, even the big four
Right.
consultancies, they make us make presentations of whatever they scratch out there in the headquarters out in London or New York. So I knew that the problem is very deep, and my people continue to be victims of this loot, this disparity in the world as a result of how their history is told. So I decided, okay, let me become the president, let me talk about this, and let me and my whole shtick was, okay, I'm going to change the syllabus if I become president. So I'm going to start a consultation that changes the syllabus and sort of tells the syllabus for what it is. So it was a big sort of a step. It was another, one of these large moon shots, and it was not literally the moon of the Earth I was aiming for. I was probably aiming for the moon of Jupiter at this point, because it was that further off and improbable. But I thought, okay, at least as part of the campaign, I'll get to say things, get a lot of campus media, and get that conversation going, which perhaps somebody can complete or put an end to in the future and actually bring out that change. So began the presidency campaign. And I think I won the election because it was not just the white and the British who were studying there at this point. There were also Africans, there were South Americans, there were the Caribbean people. Although the Indians there really were brown sea boys, but the
Mhm.
others really supported, and it was one of those silent majority that came to my aid. And not just did I become the first Indian president, I also became the president with the largest ever voter turnout ever in Oxford history,
Wow.
the largest voter margin. So there are articles about this to date about how it was one of the largest elections that Oxford University Students' Union has seen. So it was that, and then I was president.
Great. Great. So, when you say largest turnout and the victory margin, right? What was that particular thing that drew people towards your campaign, and what was it something that was not you would believe that was not offered to the students or the student union before that?
Well, I think it was this whole radical idea that we're going to start a consultation of the syllabus and change it. And that we are
Okay.
going to stop revering all of these large slave owners as
Okay.
heroes of our history. This sort of conversation wasn't happening on campus. Even if it was happening, it was happening as if it was champagne socialism or latte
Right.
socialism. There wasn't like real steps to change that. So I think I was the only president that offered that, presidential candidate that offered that. And very often, I think change starts with one person
Mhm.
speaking out and everybody finding it weird. If you look at the founding of some of the largest organizations on earth today, the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, it's one of the largest organizations on the face of earth today. But when Dr. Keshav Baliram Hedgewar started it in Nagpur, people would say, "What is this doctor doing? He was a
Mhm.
doctor by profession.
Like they would be
He's,
cynical about it. Right.
that he's uh, playing with children." That's how they
Mhm.
chose to interpret Ashaka.
Okay.
That he's an adult. What is he doing with children? And that he's playing what's happened to this doctor. They were very cynical. They were making fun of him. They were saying, ungodly things. But then look where that organization has come today. It's managed to put one of those children in the office of the prime minister of this great country, of one of the largest democracies in the world. So I think change very often starts with one person with a seemingly impossible idea, but then them sticking on to it irrespective of what the society has to say. The society will initially make fun, in the second stage accept, and in the third stage fall in love and support and madly follow. I think that's how some of the largest changes, some of the largest organizations in our society come to being. It's because people are scared. Samir, I don't think people don't want change. I think people
Mhm.
do want change, but everyone's scared. They're scared of what anybody else is going to say, what the
Right.
society is going to say, how the reaction is going to be, where the support is going to come from. Nobody wants to suffer at the altar of change.
Right.
Very few people have that courage. I'm not calling myself courageous. I was very young. I think youth brings that naivety, that reckless optimism,
Right.
and being young when I started off gave me that courage. And I think that's also part of the reason why at least I could be a small footnote in this large historical change that's happening currently in our world today.
Right. So, but then shortly after the election, you had to face, like, what kind of came out in the public forum. You had to face intense backlash, and then, like, how did that criticism, which eventually I think led to your resignation, right? So, what was that like? Looking back, do you think this controversy kind of propelled you into further bigger challenges? And one thing that I want to add is, has the professor who actually made a few comments on a public platform, I don't believe I recollect the name, but was there like a interaction with that professor in person? Was there some exchange which kind of led to some of these things coming out in the public forum?
So, I mean, it's very interesting that the history professor who put out a public post with my parents' photo and said
Right.
that Oxford is not ready for a Hindu president, and that the Hindus are, bigots and extremists and God knows what, and they don't deserve to lead an organization as prestigious as the Oxford University Students' Union, was a man I've never met in my entire life. Is a
Even
man
until today?
never interacted with, even till date, because I was a student of engineering. It's very
Mhm.
strange that this man I've never met, had no interaction with, never crossed paths with, no, overlapping concerns. It's a whole other department in another part of town. We've never even met socially because social circles were also so
Right.
different. But then this man, sets out on this ideological war against a little girl who, has no idea, who he's never met, and, tries to portray that little girl as some kind of a, extremist, and makes her, and places her at the receiving end of great many death threats, great many, attempts at doxing her address, and, a suffering that lasted over a year. So it is strange how this entire world works, where people just like to attack people they don't know based on some ideological beliefs that they hold dear. And I think ideological beliefs are blind. People are blind to them. They're
Mhm.
blind to reasoning. He was blind to reasoning. Just typecasting me as an extremist because I came from Udupi is racist of its at its purest form. So
Right.
people were incredibly racist. People were incredibly classist, and people were incredibly unaccepting of change. And I'm not talking about the majority, because the majority definitely did vote me into power. I'm talking about a small minority, but with a very loud voice, with a very loud loudspeaker, with an entire elite dispensation at their disposal, just like the Lutyens that we so often speak about.
Right. Right.
So it was the elite, which was few in number but held a great deal of influence, that was actively against me. And they held a lot of editorial power in terms of campus publications, in terms of wider publications in Britain and in the world, from Daily Mail to BBC to, Washington Post. They had a lot of this, editorial power. And it was just me against this entire machinery. And unfortunately, that was what happened. And I become president. The next day I start, not even the next day, literally 2 hours after I become president, I start getting messages like, your face resembles a black horse's, ass. That's what they said, that I'm that ugly, and that, how can somebody so ugly, so this thing, become the president. And all such sorts of mean and cheap comments were being made, just like what I think President Nixon at the point made about Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, if I don't
Right.
recollect it right. So it's all these kinds of, comments which were made, and it was horrible. The entire student sort of led media was against me. They never expected me to make it to president, because initially, before the elections, their commentary went along the lines of, who's going to vote for her? She's only going to get one vote, the vote she gives herself. And then it was a harsh wake up call for that particular dispensation, when I did actually become president of the Oxford University Students Union. So I think it was a hard wake up call for them. And it was horrible, and all kinds of things happened, not just death threats. They tried to malign my parents. They picked up an old post of my mother from Facebook, so they were stalking my mother. And we are talking about faculty stalking my mother, and that is harassment on a different level. If on
Yeah.
any
Absolutely.
campus, faculty starts to stalk a student on online, then that is, considered to be very, what do you say, um, intrusion of privacy, harassment on a different line. But they did it anyway, and none of this was reported. And it happened in the open. It was not, behind closed curtains, that, some comments were made to me in person. All of this was happening publicly on social media. It is still up for anybody to watch. And still, people chose to not call that harassment. And somehow, because I came from Udupi, because I was Hindu, I was the racist, I was the transphobe, I was the Islamophobe. um, all sorts of labels, because at end of the day, this kind of activism which tries to bring people down unreasonably is, and through label dropping, is intersectional. If you're one, then you're all the above.
Yeah.
So it was a lot of this weird intersectional activism that was happening. Let's bring this person down. And then there was an entire woke mob that came after me, because to them the reality doesn't matter. They just want a new prey to sort of go after, a new victim to, pull up. So it was all of that come together. But there was an investigation post that, because I refused to stop fighting. I resigned because, as
Hmm.
trustee of the university, and in my position, I wasn't allowed to defend myself. And all of these
Okay.
comments were being made against me, and people were like, "Oh, you're causing reputational damage," and so on and so forth. But I couldn't say anything to defend myself, and they wanted to move an article to impeach me without even giving me an opportunity to explain myself. So I thought it was best to resign from a position that gives me no freedom of speech and no respect for my heritage, and fight from the outside. So I resigned from my position as president. I continued, being a student of the University of Oxford. I filed a complaint against all of them, with starting from the police to the internal university harassment redressal procedures. And all of them did uphold my complaint, that indeed it was legitimate. And enough sort of things were brought in place to make sure that it doesn't happen again, and those perpetrators were brought to, uh, you know, were held to task for what they said. So it was in large, um, a very long process. Well, I don't know what it did to me, where it propelled me, but for me, fighting was important because fighting was survival.
Mm.
So I did not care as much as to the external optics of it as I did about surviving at that point. End of the day, I think if you're truthful and, if you stick to your morals, then you will come far, and, society does accept you. But that's just part of the, outcome. I think struggle is not easy, it's not fancy. As others like to put it, oh, you did get a lot of attention, but I don't think it's fancy. The mental state that I was in during that 1 year, I wouldn't wish it upon my worst of enemies. But I think it's necessary for us to fight, to put our foot down, and to write our own story. I wrote a Hindu in Oxford because I felt that others will define you as long as you don't try to write your own story. It's like that African proverb: until the lion learns how to write, every story will just glorify the hunter.
Right. Okay. Well, it is. I mean, kind of stressful to even hear you articulate. So it's kind of a little incomprehensible to actually understand how it might actually be to live through that experience. So I'm so sorry for you for it for you have to have been through it. If you have to give a message to the professor, or if you have any questions, what would you say to him today?
Well, I have nothing to say to them, Samir, because the kind of bigoted messages that they've been putting out against the Hindu Dharma, from including, breaking Saraswati idols, to taking pride in desecrating symbols of Hindu identity. What do you say to these people who do not have respect for all religions, who think of indigenous faiths as lesser than, and who try to, who are completely sort of taken by the stereotypes against indigenous religions, which were created to vilify them and to persecute them? And, horrendous human rights atrocities were carried out as a result of these of these narratives. And the professor who came after me, he's also indulged in this active whitewashing of
Right.
colonial crimes. If you look at some of his work, they actively pin the blame for the Bengal famine on the Hindu Mahasabha, because he thinks Bengal famine happened because of casteism and not because of the discriminatory policies of Winston Churchill, whilst it was because Winston Churchill was hoarding grains during the World War. And there is no acceptance. There is this blind faith towards the white master, and you can't wake these people up, you can't tell them what's the truth, they're set in their ways. The best way is to debunk them, is to wake up the rest of the world to the realities of what is being done in the name of academia and large funding, and take the movement forward. I have nothing to say to him, but I only hope to God that he doesn't get to victimize another student and harass them like he did to me.
Okay, fair enough. So, so let's talk a little bit about this whole identity politics thing, right? So you mentioned about the intersectionality. And like we've seen this, so it's not just limited to student politics, right? And it's a little distressing to see that this actually has percolated to the point of student politics, where it should be a lot more about the college, the university, the student campus activities, and so many of this stuff. But then to see a global trend of identity politics and race and several other ethnicity related aspects percolate to something like as sacred as a college campus, and vilify people. So and then like when you see that narrative actually go on in every election today globally that you see, identity politics it's a big thing. So it's kind of a calling card for the woke, right? So for the left, where it only matters if you belong to a certain category through that whole DEI what do you call the ideology, or like whatever narrative. So it's important for someone to be black or a woman, or certain minority, uh, where, like, people are boxed into this, and their identity, the sole identity why they should be voted in, is because they belong to that box or a label, right? So what do you what's your, like, having been through that and having been on the other side of it, right? So because if anybody had to have claimed advantage of it, it was you, because there were so many of those things. But then you didn't fight on those labels, you didn't fight because you were from a minority community, you didn't fight because you were a woman, you fought because you wanted to make your voice heard, which is what every leader should aspire to be. Not be a leader just because there are certain boxes which are ticked, but because you certainly believe in a position and an ideology, and to bring change, right? So how do you see this identity politics played out, and the merits or demerits of it?
Absolutely, Samir. There is a heavy sense of entitlement. If you're non-white, if you're a woman, if you come from a developing or a recently developed country from the global south, then there is a sense of entitlement that you should get votes because of that. Okay. And there is also a huge sense wherein you play victim, wherein you're being treated unfairly and then you use it as a platform to win the election.
Right.
So there are two aspects. Throughout the whole campaign, the other presidential candidates and the student media, which was responsible for maintenance of impartiality during the elections, would actually constantly put me down. I would be the last person to go up on stage to give speeches, although there were six other candidates. They would always mess up my name. My name is very easy for a Western person to say as well, Rashmi. And
Right.
nobody's messed it up until the elections, because elections are all about recall,
Right.
recall
Right. Right.
capacity, recall factor of someone's name. Because when somebody goes to vote, they need to recall your name.
Right.
They did all kinds of cheap tactics and cheap what do you say, they brought in all of these things. And for other positions, so there were six vice presidential positions which were up for elections as well, VP this, VP that. Even there these things happened, and women of color often came out crying, made videos saying, I'm going to pause campaigning because this is happening to me, so on and so forth. The same thing was happening to me, but I never used it. I never made a video crying or saying that give me votes because I'm being treated otherwise,
Right.
or flaunted that sense of entitlement which came from my identity, because I genuinely believe that um, change doesn't happen like that. Change doesn't happen, and change happens through mandate, and a mandate built out of pity and sympathy is a very weak mandate. It is not a it's not the kind of mandate that can change society for a for good. And I've always believed in playing fair. Even if it's unequal, then all you have to do is work harder, work smarter. And I think that's how we Indians grow up, right? Even if the situation is very um, you know um, unfavorable, all we do is we put our head down and we work harder. We don't
Right.
blame circumstances, we
Absolutely.
don't blame people, because that is what our dharma teaches us, that the world is going to be an unfair place. The world was extremely cruel to the Pandavas. They were sent away at every possible turn. They were treated with malice, with ill intentions at every possible step. But you have to fight the good fight. You can't just play victim and expect the world to take pity and restore to you what is truly yours. The world will also not respect you. And thinking of struggle, I think struggle makes character. Struggle is often used as an excuse not to excel. I think that is not who I am. At least I've never used a disparity, inequality as an excuse not to excel. Of course, when you get to power, you overcome all these struggles. It is your responsibility to make sure uh, that the society that you lead, or the organization that you lead, is fair, is fairer than the one that you had to fight through. It is your responsibility. But simply blaming it and trying to get unfair advantage of that
Right.
inequality, or trying to use it as an excuse to get ahead or not get ahead, I think that is very unfair, and that's something I do not indulge in. I'm not saying that inequality doesn't exist. But the only way to defeat inequality is to fight it with merit, take that position, and once you are the leader, change society for better. I genuinely believe that's the way to go. Because very often when you fight based on identity and entitlement of having been treated otherwise, you're actually pushing for a non-meritocratic
Right.
society,
Sort
and
of
that
a
is the
victim
worst.
card Olympics. It becomes like we used to call it a victim card game, right? So it's just
Yeah,
like
and
that.
then then it's bad for society, because the worst thing that can happen to society is for it to lose its mettle to work hard, to pull ahead, and to be genuine to its efforts. And then one or two people who are genuinely distressed might get the position. But looking at it as an example, you're going to have fake victims come up too, because then it's really easy to, grab onto power,
Right.
right? And it becomes a textbook case. So I think it's a bad example to set. Instead, the best example to set is through fight, tooth and nail through inequality, to fight through poverty, get to power, and eradicate poverty. And I think great many world leaders have done that. They fought through impossible situation, got to power, and then they eradicated the problems that they had to face coming up. That's the way to go. That's the way of a dharmic society. At least those are the values I grew up with. Secondly, I think it is very disturbing that uh, you know campuses are overrun with activists, and it is something that you do not expect. You would expect a campus to be a learning space, a
Right.
safe space where people have freedom of speech, people talk about all ideas, no matter how extreme, because you're exploring where you truly stand in the world, and you're debating and discussing all of these things. But I think, unfortunately, what we fail to see, what our society has failed to recognize is that for a very long time, the Marxists, the communists, when the middle class and the political class of Russia and China abandoned them, the middle class people of Russia and China were the people to accept communism as a principle. But
Right.
even they got tired of it. They realized it's just words and no actions that follow, and it's only lining the pockets of the leaders. And it is a political tool, and they are just being used as cannon fodder. So when people realized this, and there was a regime change both in Russia and China, Deng Xiaoping, took power, and I think somebody else took power here in Russia, and then the society changed its ethics, although they still hail communism or their Marxist history. They do not follow it. Deng Xiaoping was like the sort of time when these things changed for the better there. And also, I think there's another contemporary leader in Russia where things changed. Um, then these communists, because they have to live somewhere, they have to because they're parasites, they need something to sustain. So once the political class expelled them in Russia and China, they they came to campuses. They came onto university campuses, especially the social sciences department, and they started to paralyze these departments, and they tried to dictate the order of the world by shaping activism and political theories sitting at these very departments. And what it's done over decades, this was a very slow process and nobody saw it coming, because universities have more freedom and less censorship as compared to anywhere else. So lots of elements can grow undetected for a very long time until it becomes a huge problem. Today it's become a huge problem. The whole anti Israel movement, as we saw, began on these campuses, and they were so destructive and very hostile. In fact, it was borderline terrorizing the Jewish students on
Right.
campus, as it does terrorize a lot of ardent followers and practitioners of Hindu Dharma on campus. It's just that the voices are not heard as much because we are not united as a community when it comes to, going up against such injustices. So I think it's a large problem that developed slowly over the past, couple of decades, and today it's become a massive problem. And it needs to be countered. We need to rid our departments of these elements which have essentially ended freedom of expression, speech, debate, and have converted sacred grounds of learning into spaces that are creating activists and political theories which want to paralyze the world and take political power. So I think that is extremely disturbing that young minds are being made cannon fodder to such intent.
Yeah, you just touched upon one thing, which was going to be my next question. So you mentioned the amount of hate the Jewish community gets, and it's how terrorizing it is. But Hindu community, the Hindu students also get. But then a lot of people argue that Hindu phobia or like specific anti-Indian hate doesn't exist, and it's like I mean, it's kind of blanketed into like it's just racism, and then there is no specific reason or like anti-Indian hate or a Hindu phobic narrative. So what are your thoughts on that? Like why does it exist, if it does, and like why do people deny that?
Well, Samir, I think it's a large problem, and this problem has existed for a very long time. If you look at the roots of Hindu phobia, then you have to go to the sort of beginning of the crusades of the different Abrahamic religions. Of
Right.
course, crusades are limited when it comes to Catholic expansion, but I would look at, sort of these wars and acquisition of land and societies based on religion to be a crusade. So, be it Islamic or Christian. And I think a lot of these were motivated by religious intent back in the day. And Bharat, India, as we knew it in the 8th, 10th century, was a very strong country with respect to its politics, with respect to its military progress, with respect to its economy. For God's sake, it was 33% of the world's
Right.
economy. And it wasn't easy to, defeat a country as mighty as this. Contrary to what our historians say, our historians like to say that our people were weak, the invaders came to our borders, and we just threw our weapons and surrendered, and hence began 1,000 years of occupation and loot. That's not the case. For hundreds of years, invaders came to our doorstep, and they were met with a humiliating defeat. And although our history books do not record this, their history does record this. If you look at
It
a
does.
poem that Hali writes, he writes about wo Deen Hijaji ka bebak beda. So he writes about this mighty conqueror who's crossed the seven oceans. His um, valor is so massive that people would just throw away their weapons in front of his might. But he says, "वो डूबा दहाने गंगा के आकर," that he drowned on the banks of Ganga, that his valor drowned in the banks of Ganga, that he was defeated by the Bharatiya monarchs, by the Bharatiya kings and the Chakravartis of that time. So it beautifully describes how our people were mighty. And if you look at contemporary, dictionaries, of their language at that time, I think Farangi Amid and Lugat, the word Hindu, if you look at it at the time when they were still trying to invade us, it was written very positively. It was written to the extent of Hindu is like the beautiful black mole on a girl's cheek, or a boy who steals girls' hearts. Like a like a Casanova. It's described very beautifully. But if you look at contemporary dictionaries from 300 years later, you can see that the meaning has been distorted. Hindu is now just black, it's a thief, and it's kafir.
uh,
So from a boy who steals the girl's heart, they just picked up thief. And from a black mole on a beautiful girl's cheek, they just picked up black. So you see the distortion, right?
right.
So when they realize that they can't, you know, defeat our country with their muscle power, they decided that it was time for them to use intellect to break our backbone, to break our, entire um, belief in our systems, and then use that sense of psychological warfare to break us as a community based on caste, based on language, based on the differences that made us beautiful, that made us a vibrant society and not different. So they tried to do all of this, and even Bishop Caldwell, he started this whole theory that we were a different Dravidian race here in the south as compared to the Aryan race in the north, to then further divide the country into more pieces. So all of these attempts were made because they couldn't defeat our country with might. And you can see that every opportunity was used to either convert or kill our people. And it's something that you can historically see from early invasions of Turks, early invasions of Mongols, and their ancestors who were they were half Mongol and half Turk, because in the Turks, the Mongols had settled in Turkey, and then they had some offspring, which was a mixed race that then came to Bharat. So you see a lot of these races coming here, not just trying to acquire land, but also trying to convert, trying to lead a crusade here, and cut people based on religion and ask them to convert. And this remains till date. We see what happens in Kashmir every single day. We see what happens in West Bengal every single day. We can see what happened in Bangladesh in the 1970s, how people were just
Right.
killed mercilessly for their religion, how women were raped. And when, I think compared to all of these atrocities, what that professor said is relatively small, but he also had the guts to say that Oxford is not ready for a Hindu president, as if Hindu identity was somehow detriment of a person's capability to lead and create change in society. I mean, if it's not hatred towards a community based on its religious practices and way of life, then what is it? There is no other way to explain it, because we've been one of the most giving, one of the most accommodating, and one of the most tolerant faiths of this entire world. You have countless examples, from sheltering the Jewish people to the Zoroastrians to everybody. We've never
Right.
persecuted anybody based on their faith, but the everybody has persecuted us for our faith. So you see the contrast. Perhaps Hinduphobia is not the right word, but it is a word that is more prevalent and
Right.
acceptable within community. And I think we shouldn't look at phobia as um, a word, and look for its literal meaning. Rather, I think we
Right.
should look at the definition of Hinduphobia, which translates to anti-Hindu hatred.
Right.
So I think it's not the word, but rather the definition, and what happens, what transpires underneath, that is more important. It's akin to anti-Semitism, if you ask
Right.
me.
So a lot of this anti-ethnic hate, a lot of it is also kind of pre-programmed, like in a way that it's coming through think tanks. There is a there is a coordinated effort to kind of push a certain narrative, and a lot of it we kind of categorize it in terms of being woke, or you could colloquially, I think you can call it woke, but then academically probably there will be a lot of other terms. But if we can call it the woke politics of the world today, you see a lot of this happening even on American campuses. I believe the context of decolonization, like how we use it in India and what actually you have attempted to do in Oxford, while the same thing that gets used in the US. Like if you see, there was a lot of campaigns to probably break Christopher Columbus statues, like not celebrating the Columbus Day, and several of these things where they want to disassociate themselves from some of these colonial masters. I believe there was statues which were broken at Yale University, and this stuff. But then coming to the religious side of it, you see a lot of that happening in the UK versus the US, right? So, why do you think the US and Europe per se has gone like anti-radical, sorry, not anti-radical, but radical woke, compared to which is purely based on identity in the US, versus like it's turned like militantly radical in the US, right? Sorry, in the UK. Why do you think what's happening in the UK today, especially what's been happening for the last month or so, it's totally different. It's kind of feels like it's broken away from what has been like what we've been seeing in academia, the woke politics, the DEIs, and like the identity based politics. But now how do you see that going forward in the UK, and what do you think um, the consequential next steps to these things are? Because people keep tweeting most like very frequently that UK has fallen. You've lived there, you've studied there. How do you think like the new Labour government is equipped to handle these things, or are they even part of the entire problem?
I think a lot of where the cultural Marxists went post like their decimation in the political class was Europe. They went to Germany initially, and then they spread to larger Europe and subcontinental Europe, including the United Kingdom. And I think that's part of the reason why they've been able to also prop up political parties or hijack ethics of political parties and make it akin to what they propose. If you look at the Labour Party, then it is nothing but a form, an arm, a manifestation of whatever communism has evolved to today as a political class. It is intersectionally active. It thinks of a Muslim as persecuted
Hmm.
irrespective of the grooming gangs which they've perpetrated under the garb of um, religion and religious persecution and abuse of little children. And the United Kingdom Parliament, led by the Labour, actively, I think 500 odd votes to 1100, 111 votes, actively
They voted
blocked
against the
inquiry.
bill,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Yeah.
they actually went against an inquiry to look at little girls being raped just because they fundamentally believe that white women are never the victims, that the victim, in the intersectional scheme of things, a Muslim is on top of the pyramid. Even a woman doesn't get that space because she's white. So Muslim, brown, Pakistani, all of these are tick tick tick.
So there's
These
like a hierarchy to these things.
Absolutely. And I believe I met some people, they were so deranged, friends of friend. And these are just hearsay. These are not things that are out in the public forum. But, there was this woman who was afraid of going to the police. She was being raped. She was raped by a Pakistani man, but she didn't want to go to the police because she didn't want the police to be racist and to think of her as racist. So she didn't want to go because she didn't want to perpetuate racism at the cost of being raped. So you can imagine the sort of um, intellectual rot that has set in the face of an ideology. So I think this ideology is extremely deep rooted in the United Kingdom. It is deep rooted in America as well. I mean, look at how the Democrats reacted to the um, war between Israel and Palestine. They didn't want to say anything, and there was fast backtracking what the essential stance of the United States of America has been. And all of their sort of whole shtick about the entire presidential race this time was also identity driven. It was about the gender, it was about the color of the presidential candidate over what policies they had to bring to the table. So I think it's quite similar, although the nuances change. The nuances would definitely change more depending on the context of the historical background of the country, which is very different for America, given it was a settler colony, and United Kingdom, given it was originally white. And there's also a heavy religious context which comes in when it's the United Kingdom, a Protestant country, to America, which has mostly been a settler colony for
Right.
prisoners who didn't have space in jails in Britain uh, when they occupied America. So I genuinely believe that the basic intent is the same. It's all about grabbing political power based on this entire list of who's the victim and who's the oppressor. And the oppressed oppressor list is a set list. It is not situational. A man could be oppressed, but he would always be the oppressor as a function of his gender and not his circumstances. So I think these are fundamental identities and these are fundamental things that both of them use. And Britain has indeed fallen as a result of that. But at least America managed to save itself in this term. I think
Right.
that's fundamentally what's different. Um, yeah.
Yeah. So, so if you had to communicate a message, or like at least your belief, like since NRIs living in the UK, they can vote, right? So, do you think Indians should go conservative or labor, given that, like, both parties have their own interests which kind of harm our interests, including but, like, not limited to Kashmir, but maybe other as well, like LGBTQ, climate change, and other stuff. How do you think, like, India UK relationship would pan out in the next few years with the current labor dispensation? If it
Well,
continues next term, do you think our political discourse, giving our historic relations, between the two countries?
Samir, I genuinely believe that Hindus and Indian origin people are the safest in India. Everywhere else, it's always going to be a balance walk, and people will have to decide for themselves if risks are worth the benefits. Now, in America, with the Republicans coming to power, of course, it did look good, but then there are some extreme racists within that conservative class as well.
Right.
And Indian conservative politics is not the same as American conservative politics, because that is seated in Christianity, in an Abrahamic faith, and we are seated in Dharma, which are polar opposites in their beliefs. So, although they come under the same category, they are polar opposites. There's very little space for migrants who are high functioning, who are contributing, who are non white, in a society, who are non Christian, in a society that goes, conservative in the West as compared to the East. And these, temporary sort of bridges which might exist during elections or post elections are only, situational, and it can change at any point. And it is only better of the two evils, to a large extent. I think fundamentally what is required now is for us to sacrifice and build up our nation in a way that then fortifies our position for the future. When the Jewish state of Israel was formed, people actually left well-paying jobs in America. They
Right.
sacrificed comfort to build a country that their future could live in a great way. And I think that's something that we need to do. We never did, because fundamentally, for some reason, a thousand years of occupation has led us to believe and function in a way that is day to day, that is very situational. We just think of what is today and tomorrow, and not about generations to come. So I think that fundamental change in thinking is needed. It can come through better education system. The time is to build impact, build a country that we can all be safe in together, and make sure that those forces do not enter our country, then end up being orphan in other countries. When the whole Afghanistan crisis was happening, I have observed this crisis from a government position in a different country. I don't want to reveal the details of what position I held, but I was within the government in a Western country, and I saw that you know citizens who held British passports, uh, but they were naturalized citizens, not citizens who
Were born in,
generationally were British,
right, like,
um, were given a second preference.
okay.
Today, Indians cannot hold two passports, and when we take on passports of a different country, we let go of our own passport.
Right.
We end up becoming naturalized citizens. We will never be citizens by birth or origin,
Yeah. Right.
and that puts us at a disadvantage. It is like ghar ka na ghat ka, uh, and we are neither accepted manelli bdli. We are out of both options. We can neither
Yeah.
sleep on the streets nor in our own homes. So it's better to stick on to what is ours, build on it, than live in the illusion of temporary adjustments and temporary alliances formed abroad. Because other is always other, and ours is always ours. And in this fight of political identity and everything, racism can come from both ways, because we have to fundamentally understand that we are the only people who look at the world as Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. The others don't look at the world like that. Our fundamental worldview is very open, broad, accepting, but the fundamental worldview of everybody else is the opposite. So there's very little space to exist when that happens. It's important for us to get out of this well that we live in, that everyone's accepting and open, and build for ourselves a fortress where we're all safe.
Right. So, I want to come back to the Hindu aspect, because there are, I know, are you doing okay with time? Can we take like 10 more minutes and
Yeah,
close it?
10 more minutes is good.
Yeah. Okay. So, so there is a little bit of positivity as well, right? So if you see, there is the recent elections in the US, they do seem to have a lot of people, if not Hindu but Indian origin. Although their politics will definitely and need to be American centric, but then it seems to be like a welcome change from a radical woke Islamist ideology to someone who believes in a similar value system, like how we saw Vivek Ramaswamy making very very articulate points that why his value system, although being Hindu, does align with an American democratic setup. And then we see people like Tulsi Gabbard and several others who are actually now getting an active role. So, are you? Would that kind of make you more hopeful to not just in from an Indian political sense, because we have our own challenges. Like even somebody like Prime Minister Modi has not been spared of having strong value systems. India being a secular sort of quote unquote secular country, someone like the stature of a prime minister also is not kind of allowed to have their own belief systems, and often criticized, even for that matter, Yogi Adityanath ji and several others, right? So we have our own challenges, but then it seems that the tide, would you say the tide is kind of turning in the Western discourse, where they have started to understand Hinduism a little bit better, and that kind of is bringing other challenges like we saw with the H1B and the other stuff.
Well, Samir, I don't quite agree with it. Whilst Rishi Sunak was Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, he too was ridiculed for his Hindu faith. So was Preeti
Right.
Patel, who was the Home Secretary before that. They were called everything. There was a caricature of Preeti Patel as a cow, and Rishi Sunak was called everything from a cow worshipping, backward person to other ungodly things. Tulsi Gabbard has been called everything from a witch to a person following, I don't know, satanic rituals.
Right.
That's
Like
not going to
being part of,
end.
I think Atlantic wrote an article that she's part of a cult or something.
Absolutely. And there were articles about this even when she ran for congresswoman back in the day. So the attacks are going to be relentless. There isn't going to be acceptance of faith as we want it to be. Even Vivek had to face, I mean, even among the Republican class, there is a class
Right.
which will never accept him. Of course, we are able to carve a space for ourselves because we're incredibly hardworking, we're incredibly, trustworthy, and we deliver when time demands. We are incredibly smart, but acceptance of that is circumstantial. That's what I genuinely believe, that today there is a necessity to show that kind of camaraderie among communities because the Hindu community has one of the most accomplished high earning capital community, but we need to come together based on our strengths and maintain a lobby like the Jewish community does. We can't take the advances we've made or the leads we've generated for granted. We are all fragmented and we all are excelling in silos.
Mhm.
And that's why the attack is there. And when the attacks happen, we are not able to respond to it in the concrete way that we need to. I mean, responding to trolls on social media and maintaining a narrative is no part of the kind of response that needs to be put up. It needs to be organizational, it needs to be multi tier, like how the Jewish community does in America, irrespective of whether Democrats or Republicans are in power, their interests are always preserved. So we need to come together like that when we have some advantage, and we need to build such deep connections, build deeper organizations that can lobby actively for the interests of the community. We cannot become complacent thinking that we very often do. Sometimes every time an Indian name becomes something, we're so ecstatic and so happy. We did that for Kamala Harris as well,
Right. Right.
and we all know how that turned out. So I think it is necessary for us to cash in and to build an organization so deep that our own people do not step away from their commitment to the community, and that we have uh, things in place for a future where they may not wield so much power.
Okay. Fair. Um, So I have just a couple of short questions, right?
Sure.
So, and then we can end it. So, having experienced life outside, and I'm sure you have a lot of connections who might be willing to visit India. And like, this month, I think it was yesterday or the day before, like we had the Kumbh Mela, which started. So, if you had to explain someone about Hinduism in like one sentence, who people like, as I said, like, people are getting started to notice, okay, what is the Hindu way of life? Because in the US, a lot of people are trying to understand that, okay, this is one of the most prosperous communities, but then there is still a lot of misunderstanding and misconceptions, right? And today you see a lot of people who are traveling to India for the Kumbh Mela, right? So if you had to explain Hinduism to someone who has not experienced this Sanatan Dharam in one sentence, what would you, how would you approach
Well,
it?
Samir, I believe you can't wake people up who are asleep, and a lot of the West is like that. Everybody knows about Hindu Dharma and how beautiful and spectacular it is. And the people who do recognize that do travel to India and become part of these celebrations. People have waited almost 3 decades. There was a woman who's 58, and she says she's white, and she says that she's waited on as from, you know, when she was 20 years old. So I think people who want to know about it have enough resources and outlets to know about it, but you can't really wake people up who are pretending to be asleep. You can only fight them. So from my genuine experience, I believe that those who want to know about it already do.
Okay, okay. And if you had to expose someone to India, like, one place in India, what would what's your like go to place for people to understand India?
Well, the temple town of Bharat, Udupi, I think there's nothing more beautiful than this place and the
Yes.
kind of altruism, the kind of Anna Seve, Anna Dana that's been happening since 8th century or even before. It's a beautiful place, temples every 500 meters, ancient, beautiful, preserved, clean, and still relatively under the control of civilians and not the government. So I think this would be a beautiful place. I would also like to take them to Kashi because that is also one of my favorite cities, favorite towns in the whole world.
Okay. Well, that brings us to the end of our discussion. Thank you
Thank
so much for your
you.
time.
Thank you, Samir. It was wonderful talking to you. I hope we get to do this some other time as well.
Sure. Great. Thank you so much. So I'll cut it here. But then I actually wanted to talk about the regional politics as well. I'm sure like there might be a lot of
Let's
things to
let's
talk.
do na. Let's do another podcast.
Yeah, sure.
I
Yeah,
don't mind.
because I didn't want to like kind of
Crowd
plan.
everything in one.
Yeah, and then it kind of like, it's very difficult to segue into, while talking about the global narrative, because I mean, I'm also getting used to the format. So
You
not
take
that.
my number, Samir, and
Sure.
you can
Yeah.
just WhatsApp me.
Sure.
You can just save it nine
Yeah.
six three two
1 second. 9632
seven three four
734
double one two.
112. Okay, I'll
We
save
can
your
just
number.
schedule something when we're free and have a 1 hour conversation and
Great.
whatever is topical or whatever you think.
Yes.
I think it'll be nice.
Great. Yeah. Thank you so much. It'll be good to have someone who would be willing to come on, whenever there are like, because I do have a couple of people who I'm going to use as fillers. I don't mean to you to be like that, but then it'll be good because if there are topical conversations, like, I mean, I'm also very much tuned into Karnataka politics, which is its own
Oh,
animal, right? So it's like extremely complex. I think there are few states in India like Bihar and Karnataka, like nobody gets. Uh,
but I think Karnataka is not like Bihar. At least people are not so weird. People are
no,
not
no,
so.
it's not about people. It's about the combinations. Like, it's so unpredictable, right?
Hmm.
So at least like, I mean, when I say Bihar, right, I meant to say, um, after I think 2004, like, um, it took like 15 to 20, 15 years for Karnataka to get like a one proper stable government. And that used to be the case of Bihar as well, right? There were so many governments would fall and like kind of do a lot of horse trading and do all of that. I think only in 2019 there was, and even that government kind of fell. This is the only government in 2023 or 22 December or November which happened, which Congress got like a full majority after probably 2 decades. Until then, it's been
I think it's because of a combination of the, Yediyurappa phenomena. I think they
Right,
should
right.
have continued him as chief minister right until the elections,
Yeah,
not told him that he's not going to get it, and then, make up their own list of candidates. Because he's anyway CM, so he would anyway go campaign for all of them because it would become his reputational thing.
yeah, yeah.
Get
That was a
the
big
thumping
mistake. Like
majority. Just like
they
they did
should.
with Shivraj Chauhan, right? Shivraj Singh
Yeah,
Chauhan, what they did is they got the thumping majority. Then they
and
were
then
like,
changed
we
it.
are not
Yeah,
going to be CM anymore.
yeah,
And they've done it so many times over. I don't know why they got it wrong here in
yeah.
Karnataka.
It's a case study actually. They did it in even in Telangana, where
Mhm.
I stay. Like 6 months before the election, they changed the state president. Until then, there was like significant momentum. So yeah, so I mean, they which is why it said like in its own animal. Like there's so much complexity. There's so many layers of like if you see for the last 20 years, I lived in Davangere where I studied. So from 2002 to 2006, and it was like a moment, like a time of absolute turmoil. Like 2005, six is when, like I think after SM Krishna's period, the state has been in turmoil continuously,
Absolutely. And Samir,
right?
I believe that, you need to get rid of this whole Vokkaliga Lingayat politics that Yediyurappa is
Yeah,
trying to bring so that he can preserve his political fortunes
vote
here.
bank. Yeah, yeah.
This state is not a casteist state, but
Yeah,
they're making it an incredibly casteist state. So I
yeah,
think that is something I
yeah.
don't like.
I remember my father used to talk about Anant Kumar, Anant Kumar ji, like because at that time he was the state like the big tallest leader, even bigger than Yadurappa, right? So since then, after he passed away, I think kind of like the turmoil has continued. So yeah, it's going to be interesting, and then it seems to be heating up again with so much of political controversies that are happening in the state. So yeah,
But
it'll be.
the BJP is not able to, capitalize on anything.
Yeah, same
It's
problem
just
even in Telangana. I say like exactly, you can actually carbon copy both of the states and see how they have let these two states. When I say two states, although Telangana is smaller, but then they are extremely important, right? Like Bangalore and Hyderabad are like the
their
two.
money bags.
Yeah,
After
exactly,
Mumbai, I think it's Bangalore and Hyderabad. Even if
exactly.
you have five states in the north, it's nothing
It
compared to
doesn't
having
really.
one Karnataka and one
Exactly, exactly.
Telangana.
Which
It's,
is why I compare. So and then both of them were in the grasp of the party, and then they
yeah,
let it
and
through
they
their grasp.
ruined it big time, big time.
Yeah, yeah. So
So
yeah, yeah.
lovely
So
speaking to you,
yeah, same
Samir.
here.
Do send the this thing. It says 59% uploading. That's what it's been saying
Yeah,
for.
so you have to leave it. So I'll stop this. I'll just like stop it. So um, you just have to leave it for like a minute or two.